Good afternoon, and welcome to the Stantec Water webinar series. Today's session features economic experts Jeremy Bess and Patrick Luce. They will discuss how macroeconomic trends are reshaping water utility operations, offer strategic insights and practical tools to forecast costs, optimize budgets, and build economic resilience. I'm Tony Fink, your hostess. During this session, you will be in listen-only mode. We invite you to submit questions at any time during the presentation by selecting the Q&A icon at the top of your screen. Your questions will be addressed following the presentation. And with that, Patrick, I'll pass it over to you to get us started.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. We are keeping everyone's budgets above water with macroeconomic insights. I swear we only have just a few more puns from here as we go through our presentation. But before we roll up the sleeves and dig in, at Stantec, we love to start these events with a safety moment. And for Jeremy and I, we tend to think about just the driving. We live in Florida, so driving is always front of mind, and specifically heading into the office, just using situational awareness about as it relates to backing in, pulling into parking spaces, making sure that you don't leave the garage with any dings, dents, scratches, or what have you. So wanted to make that little flag here. And as I mentioned, we are two economists, myself, and joining me today is Jeremy Bess, or as we call him at my house, Uncle Jeremy. We're part of Stantec's market economics team, and we're not like regular economists. So just to keep that in mind, we are cool economists. And I know Jeremy rolls his eyes every time I say that because he's known me for 15 years and not once has he ever described me as cool, but I'm going to do my best to manifest it. But at the end of the day, we're not like regular folks. We're going to give you actionable insights. We're not going to ruminate over academic theories. We're apolitical, so no policy debates or politic debates. We're just going to take the data as we see it and as it informs our long-term outlooks to better inform your own budgeting and strategic initiatives.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks everyone for joining. And happy to still be that guy. Happy to be the Uncle Jeremy to the Luce family. So thanks for the opportunity. But let's dive into today. When I think about economics and when I think about the news, maybe, and this is again, it's not about being political. It's about understanding where we're going, in the economy, where we're going for certain markets. And I thought this was interesting. I logged in just a few months ago to, name the periodical, right? And it's kind of always like this. It feels like it's always like this every morning. But you come in here, and this was during the first quarter results of GDP. And I kind of opened this up and I went, oh my gosh, this is the most dizzying, piece of news I've ever seen. It tells me right off the bat, U.S. economy contracts first time in 3 years. But then you start reading the other, headlines there, and you go, well, M&A activities accelerating, decent, job report at the time. I'm looking at this going, wait, what is good? What is bad? Where are we really going? And unfortunately, a lot of the headlines don't help with that, right? And you start diving into this. And our goal today is to kind of, read through the headlines, look at the hard data, and actually give you forecasts to better plan, specifically from, a leadership perspective and executive perspective. And so just going to start off with something. On this chart here, looking at two of our forecasts. So two indicators. On the left-hand side, it's really kind of big headline, U.S. consumer prices. I think of this as like the Wall Street Journal headline. It's not really the one that the Federal Reserve looks at, but this is the one that we're all understanding when we think about inflation. And so just to calibrate, that black line that you'll see, and we'll kind of show this throughout today's presentation, is the historical data. And if you're seeing like this gray shaded region there, that's our modeling to say how we're going to better predict what happened in the past to use for what we're expected to see in the future. But we kind of narrowed down that range a bit to give you a true forecast, a smaller, tighter range. And that will always be shown in orange. And now you can see on that left-hand side that there's a little overlap, right? That black line overlaps over the orange. And that is because we have not revised our forecast since, I believe, September of 2024. And that's the same on the right-hand side with U.S. industrial production. Again, what we're looking at here is year-over-year growth rates. Why I'm showing you this is because these forecasts were put in place before elections, before tariff implications, before all the noise around Federal Reserve holding interest rates higher, maybe not revising or bringing them down. A lot going on here. And now you might say, well, wait, how accurate were these forecasts? And right? If we look at through June, and some of this data, we just got CPI data, consumer price data yesterday, but through June, 99.98% accurate on US consumer prices, 99.48% on industrial production. I'm simply telling you all this because when you're talking about forecasts, the big question you might have is, well, how accurate is that forecast going to be? Can I put stake into what these cool economists are saying today? And so I'm just going to leave you with this kind of broad, I guess, blanket summary for today's presentation. I want you to consider that we are saying as we head into 2026, and if hopefully you're in that kind of budget season now, we should be expecting moderate or modest economic growth. However, we're going to be dealing with what we kind of call in the economics world sticky inflation. Simply put, higher or maybe more elevated levels of inflation than expected, right? It's kind of a headline right now, sticky inflation. But just think of this as maybe higher than what the Federal Reserve kind of maybe wants or is expecting to see. And you'll see as we go through today's presentation, they have also been, kind of catching up to some of our forecasts here. But again, modest economic growth and sticky inflation. Now, what you're going to do with this information today, right? If you're thinking about what to do with your budget perspective, we're going to be using this from anticipating costs, right? We're going to be talking about cost escalation factors. We will talk about broad CPI, but we'll start narrowing a bit into probably markets that you all matter. And by the way, if you're up in the Great White North of Canada, we'll be overlaying a bit of Canada's expectations and kind of comparison charts throughout today's presentation as well. We're going to use this data to refine and kind of test our budgets. And ultimately, the goal of this is, right, enhance financial sustainability. Are you going to be able to use this data to hit your goals? Do we need to rethink about some of our, financial planning?
And the way we're going to talk about things today, and Jeremy's already shown a couple of forecasts, and we're doing exactly this. We're transforming raw data into annual year-over-year trends or percentage changes, comparing, say, July of 2025 to July of 2024. And that's what the chart on the left is showcasing. This way, what we can do as communities, as organizations, as planners, we can effectively look out into the future and understand the business cycle as it ebbs and flows within a given data set. And we're going to pepper you with a lot of data sets today, and this is how we're going to look at it, is that chart on the left with that annual year-over-year percentage change. And why that's important is because we can glean insights from different phases of the business cycle, whether those annual year-over-year percentages are positive and getting more positive, that's expansion. So if you look at that chart or infographic on the right, expansion means positive growth at an accelerating or expanding pace. During that period of time, you want to make sure that you're not planning linearly, meaning that planning based upon what has happened. Ultimately, you want to plan on what is going to happen, because oftentimes we see that expansion turn to deceleration, meaning positivity. But at the end of the day, that positivity is going to typically turn into more slowing growth or decelerating growth. And then you have negativity, where those annual year-over-year trends are below zero. So just wanted to level set. There's different strategies to deploy during different phases of the business cycle, and we want to make sure that you're cognizant of that. Because at the end of the day, we are very cognizant that we don't want you to be planning linearly. And the problem with linear planning is that when you think about just taking prior trends, and what I mean by linear planning is planning based on what has happened and just extracting and extrapolating that into the future. We can look at a very important case study as it relates to informing your budgets. We've transformed the consumer price index into an annual year-over-year, typically how inflation is reflected. And a lot of folks will use inflation as a cost escalator in their long-term planning. And if you were doing this during the 2010s, you could look at CPI inflation, that orange line, and say, oh, it generally hovers around 2%. Well, gosh, if I were to expect the next 5 years to hover around 2%, well, now I have some basis for that. I'm planning linearly. But folks, what do you expect happened to that orange line in 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024? Well, let's reveal it. Let's see what now happens when we think about the past. We are talking about inflation at higher levels and a big run up in inflation. And ultimately, if you weren't planning for a surge in inflation, your budgets were likely behind. And that's the premise here. We want you to think about forward-looking evidence. And what Jeremy and I do is we use leading indicators as part of that forward-looking evidence. And so if you want to think about the pricing environment, let's consider some good leading indicators that you all should be looking at. And that is the monetary policy situation. When we talk about the Federal Reserve that Jeremy has already name dropped, and the level of money supply in the economy and interest rates, because those give us good forward-looking evidence into where inflation is heading. And you can see that orange line is the real money stock, and the black dashed line is CPI inflation. And at the end of the day, you can kind of maybe, if you do a little mental gymnastics, line up those peaks and say, yeah, I can see that there's some forward-looking evidence. Well, Jeremy and I try to do this with a ton of leading indicators to get the consensus, and we shift them forward by saying, well, I see two peaks there. And what does the math tell us is the lead time between those two peaks? And for money supply, it's actually about an 18-month lead to inflation. And so if we had been leaning on things like money supply and deficit spending and global supply chain pressures, we would have gotten good forward-looking signals that inflation in 2020 and 2021 was going to start ramping upwards. Now, when we think about present day and into the future, where is inflation heading? Well, let's consider that we now have a signal of an upcoming low in the inflationary environment right around now. And we're seeing that in the data. We are seeing June and July CPI inflation starting to bottom out and transition to more expansion in inflation. And that's that stickiness that Jeremy was referencing. And so when we do this enough times, we look at enough leading indicators, we consider that cyclicality within the inflationary environment, we can think about our inflation forecast that Jeremy has shown. And so we're talking about higher levels of inflation to inform your planning. You're talking about 3.5% to 4% of consumer price index inflation, just a broad measure of inflation. I know there's a lot of specificity. Some of that Jeremy and I will get into today. But when we think about just the broader inflationary drivers, we can think about just the overall trade patterns. And this is not a new phenomenon. I know it's getting a lot of headlines right now about trade patterns and what's going on in the overall economic climate and the reshoring activity that's coming into the United States that tends to put upward pressure on prices. We can talk about just demand. You can't have pricing growth without demand. And then we can also focus on some core structural changes, whether it's the tight labor market or demographic shifts. The US economy and most advanced economies are becoming very top heavy, meaning that we have a very large population of baby boomers heading into retirement. And what that's doing is creating a bit of a vacuum for skills gap because we don't have enough people behind them thinking about the next generation of Generation X. There's not enough to backfill the baby boomers for the skills standpoint. And we think about Generation Z, which is the new entrance into the workplace, not enough headcount. So that's going to put upward pressure on the wage environment. Those demographic shifts are going to continue to place upward pressure on the overall pricing environment or overall inflationary environment, as we'll just continue deficit spending. And we can then spend hours talking about the federal budget, and we can spend hours talking about what interest rates mean, but we're just going to lean on those leading indicators right now and also come in and say that it's not all doom and gloom, or it's not all high drivers of inflation. Also factored into our forecast are just innovation, technology, productivity gains, and the Federal Reserve's policy decisions. They've decided to change or keep interest rates higher throughout this year, or the federal funds rate higher throughout 2025 than they were originally planning. And so all these factored in create this shape. And again, talking about that chart on the right, thinking more like 3.5%, 4%, just broad measure inflation heading out into the future.
I think what's interesting too, if we start to compare, I guess North America and maybe parking, Mexico for a minute here. If we look at Canada CPI versus US CPI, Patrick knows that I have a soft spot for Canada. I get the privilege and pleasure to sometimes head up there to the Muskoka area and the cottage country. So always happy to dive into the Canada data. But you can see there's some relationship here. There's some similarities across nations, and it makes sense, right? Big trading partners to one another. Some of the maybe labor pressures that we're talking about, wage pressures that we're going to dive into later, exist in Canada just like they do in the U.S. Again, there's some semantics there. But generally speaking, it would be one sign to say, wow, Canada CPI would likely be a little bit more elevated as well than maybe what was going on in again, the 2010s period. Now, right now, there's some divergence going on, and this may partly be due to some of the tariff implications or just general trade implication. Has a bit to do with commodities as well, right? And kind of where Canada exists on the supply chain. But if we start thinking about those upside pressures, we're starting to see commodity prices rise. We're starting to see demand in Canada start to pick up some steam, and we'll put that in context later. And then ultimately, like I mentioned, those wage pressures do exist. Now, we're not here to dive too deep into the tariff conversation, but when I do think about global trade, we have to talk about it a bit because it is one of those, I guess, broad and longer term outlooks on why we expect inflation to be, again, quote, sticky or elevated. What we're looking at on this chart, everyone, those gray bars that you kind of see over time continuing to rise, is overall trade. That is the summation of imports and exports in the US. Now, if you look at this, we say, oh my gosh, well, generally speaking, the U.S. is very global trade, right? We continue to trade with everyone, at least again from a total share perspective. But well, hang on, that might not be fair because the U.S. economy generally grows, right? Barring the big events, COVID and the Great Recession, right? Kind of as some recent examples. So if we were to adjust for the size of our economy, take the overall trade, divide it by overall GDP, that's that orange line. And you can see right around 2012, we kind of hit a peak, and it's been declining since. That general trend that we're seeing where the U.S. is becoming, again, involved with, more onshoring and reshoring, and maybe, again, less overall trade as a percentage of our growth, has been declining. And that trend is what we were already assuming last year. And so when folks were telling us, hey, are you revising your forecast? This was the March, April timeframe. A lot of economists were changing forecasts. We actually said, well, I didn't know the magnitude of the tariffs. But for us, we were already assuming, some of those global trade patterns specifically going on in North America. So that trend is what allowed us to say, hey, we expect stickier levels of inflation or just elevated levels of inflation as we head out in the next few years. Now, parking trade for a minute, we do have to talk about the Federal Reserve again. We've brought them up a few times. And when we think about the Federal Reserve, it's not the end all be all of levers that they have to pull on to manage inflation because, quite frankly, they have a mandate that says, well, they're supposed to have inflation be closer to 2%. And again, the consumer price index, it's not really the measure that they look at, but it's a general proxy for where inflation's going. But they have control over our interest rates, right? This is going to have an impact on how businesses are hiring, how consumers are borrowing, so on and so forth. And that measure is called the federal funds rate. We're looking at this on the black line over time, and you can see, right, it peaked around the 2024 timeframe, and then they started to pull back late last year. And then over the last few months, it's really just been somewhat stable. And that goes back to what Patrick was saying, where last year they said we were expecting a few more decline, right? A few more periods of pulling down the federal funds rate. Now, just want to put this out there. It is very common for the Federal Reserve to change their tone. And so what you're looking at on those gray kind of dashes there is actually what they said over time, right? Thinking about where they said the federal funds rate is going to be over the next year, 2-year, 3-year, and actually ultimately what they call their longer term expectation. And you can see that, boy, they revise often. They have a tough job where they're trying to manage expectations. And so it is, again, likely to see them change their tone. But generally speaking, they've been telling us that rates should be coming down. They don't live up there forever, although they've been changing where they expect maybe that level to be over the long term. But nonetheless, it should be lower than it is today. Now, what does this mean? What does this mean for you all? Well, the one big thing that I think about is what that means from a borrowing implication, right? If you're taking out debt, and this isn't just for businesses, or if you think about it from a mortgage perspective, if you're going out there to buy a new home, if we track federal funds rate on the orange line compared to the 30-year mortgage rate, for example, right? And we can insert other things, right? Bond yield, so on and so forth. There's a general tight relationship. It's, again, not a one-for-one relationship. But overall, if we were to say, well, the Federal Reserve is signaling, which is those kind of those orange dots you see into the future, signaling where they expect interest rates to be over the next couple years, well, then we can kind of get an idea that that should put downside pressure on mortgage rates. But context is key. We're not talking about the 3-4% mortgage rates that we were kind of dealing with in that, again, 2019, 2018 timeframe. Or maybe even the 2020 timeframe, if you really locked in when interest rates, kind of plummeted during the pandemic period. We're not talking about that, right? We still would be, we would be hard pressed to even approach 5% over the next year or so. Now, what does this mean? Right? What if we think about it from a housing perspective? Well, housing affordability is highly impacted by mortgage rates. Right, so this is going to have an impact on new meter growth in the water space. Actually, it's just economic growth in general in terms of building new properties. But what we're looking at on this chart, everyone, is if we were to take the average price home in each state, and then you're looking at the average income in each state and making some assumptions on, well, if you're going to buy that house, you should be putting 20% down, right? We look at current mortgage rates around 6.6%. And then, putting some guardrails on, how we should be dealing with some of our finances and saying, okay, 30% of your income should go towards housing. If your state is red, it means you need additional income, or really the consumer needs additional income to afford the average price home in that state. And now you can see that most states are red. As a matter of fact, there's only 4 that are green, meaning that they have enough income to support the average price home. Now, by the way, remember when I said you'd be hard pressed to get around 5%? If we were to make this 5%, now I'm going to change the slide here. So if you blink, you might not see it. Let's change it to 5%. You can see some states do get a little bit green or greener, right? But still, that's only 13 states that can afford the average price home, even at 5%. So it would help, but it's not the end all be all. We still need wages to increase. We're seeing some cooling off in house prices, which may impact that. But if we start to think about what that means for wage growth, we can say, well, geez, let's look at wage growth by state. That's also helping. Again, we kind of need a bunch of things to help out at this point. So we need interest rates to come down. We need wage growth to continue to rise. And generally speaking, they are. Right? If we look at, again, year-over-year growth rates in average annual wage growth, you can see that there's a wide range. But nonetheless, they're generally above the inflation in the inflation rate, which means that's positive for the consumer. Now, what that also might mean, though, is, boy, I've just said high borrowing costs are likely to play out over the next few years. I also said wage growth is elevated, and Patrick's going to share with us a forecast. But when you think about building something, you think about those capital improvement plans, well, a high percentage of those capital improvement plans are generally labor intensive. And so now we're starting to talk about higher labor growth. So impacts affordability, but boy, it does have an impact on some of those budget plannings that we were talking about.
So again, where are we heading? What should we be anticipating as far as budgeting plans go? A lot of it is state specific. A lot of it is what type of employment we are talking about. But if we zoom out, Jeremy and I talk the macro economy, which can be overlaid in a lot of those discussions. We can just consider overall median wage. And the same chart that we've been using to showcase our forecast, the black line is what has historically happened. The gray area is our model forecast range. And then the orange area is our active forecast. This is another one of those forecasts that we've had on since September of 2024. It's about 99.8% accurate through June. And what we are talking about is a little wobble within the next 2 years within the wage growth perspective, talking about finishing the year around 4.34% year over year in 2025, a little dip in 2026. Really important to consider the context, the labor market, the wage market, unemployment, the jobs announcements that we just heard, slowing, cooling off, heading towards the bottom of the business cycle in that space. But it's also important to note that labor, income, they generally lag the broader macroeconomic forces. And we want to consider the longer term trend and longer term trajectory. That black line, COVID notwithstanding, has been ascending since the Great Recession time period. That black line bottomed out right around 2010, and it's been on an upward slope ever since, really highlighting some of those demographic challenges that are pretty persistent in the United States as more and more of the baby boomers exit the workforce. It's less and less supply. And then we have just additional considerations as we try to reshore activity and bring on more demand and more production in the US. What does that mean for construction employees, industrial employees, and manufacturing employees? It's not to say this is all rosy by any means. There's definitely a bifurcation within the labor markets. So it's really important to consider some of those microeconomic context. If we had, again, another hour to talk about the labor market, we could dig into those. But for now, what I want to do is just overlay the macroeconomic environment in the US to the macroeconomic environment in Canada. And so while Canada is facing a little bit higher levels of unemployment when we talk about the US, we are still seeing pretty strong average earnings growth on a year over year basis there. And so what we're showcasing is the black dotted line now is the Canadian earnings. The US orange line is that same forecast that we were showing you all. It's not that they always perfectly align with one another. You can see that these have different ebbs and flows over time because even though we're pretty connected, the US and the Canadians' economies, they are slightly diverse. I think Canada has a bit more manufacturing, a little bit lower on the value chain as it relates to just supplies and production. And so I think that's reflected here. And then we can just talk about the restrictive immigration policies that were already ongoing in Canada, putting some upward pressure on wages. But again, thinking about heading into the future, we are not talking about the 2010s level of wage growth. We are talking about higher levels of wages. And so if you're thinking about your budget expectations, make sure that you're factoring in these higher levels of wages. And so we just want to walk through a little bit of a stress test that we're doing with it's $100 million budget and just juxtaposing some of our forecast as it relates to some baseline expectations. If you're using the linear planning or saying, hey, we're going to revert back to a 3%. So if we talk about some of those core operations type expenditures, compensation, chemicals, power, and just kind of the other type of expenditures that you're facing, and capital, we can see that we're planning and we're expecting, we're telling our clients to budget for a higher level of cost pressures. And that's, on the basis of our analysis on median wages, chemicals, price per kilowatt hour. Our capital expenditure forecasts are very specific as it relates to the construction materials, fabricated pipe and pipe manufacturing, some of those commodity prices, and then the wages. And if we look at just a capital improvement program, how do we contain or come up with a weighted cost index? So we're showcasing a fairly general one here. And you might look and say, well, gosh, if I'm planning on 3% for all these categories like that black bar is showing, that's not that different from what the orange bars are showing, which is our Stantec 5-year average. And those orange bars are only about 1.5% greater than what you see in that 3% baseline. And you might say, well, 1.5%, not a huge deal. And gosh, I would love to agree with that in and of itself, but at the end of the day, we have to consider compounding effects. And so when we think about how we overlay these cost escalation factors onto an example budget of $100 million, and we're just focused on the operating side because I didn't even want to start talking about all the different funding sources and variances that we need to consider there. But if we just focus on an operating budget, we can consider what the annual differences in expected expectations in cost. Those are those gray bars. And so if we were to use a 3% baseline expectation versus the Stantec forecast, 2025, there'd be no difference because that's our first budget year, our test year. But then when we get to 2026, we're talking about a difference of costs of about $500,000. And then if we get to 2027, we're talking about a difference between that baseline 3% and the Stantec forecast of about $1.12 million. And then you can see 2028, 2029, and then all the way to 2030. So over a 5-year plan, we're talking about the difference of about $3.1 million of operating expenditures that may not have been planned for. And another way to say that is a 3% difference or delta on your budget. That's meaningful because what that means is more erosion of days cash on hand than previously planned. That means reduced cash available for capital funding. That means weaker borrowing performance indicators, whether it's your coverage ratios or those days cash on hand. And that subsequently, those weaker borrowing KPIs can lead to upward pressure on rates, which Jeremy has already said. We are anticipating higher levels of interest rates for the remainder of the decade. That tends to trend along and track along with the inflationary environment. But if you are now facing higher levels of borrowing and weaker KPIs, that's going to compound some of that effects. We're talking about a capital program that is not only facing higher levels of inflation, but also higher levels of borrowing costs than were previously planned for. So it's incredibly important to make sure that you are stress testing your budgets. You're considering these higher, more sticky levels of inflation.
I think we're going through a lot here, everyone, and there's a good chunk more, right? So there's a good chunk more. In a minute, we're really going to start to say, how do you use this? Why should you be using this, right? We're talking macroeconomic things. How does that impact, me in the local area? And we'll get there. But if we start to take a step back, say, where are we right now in the presentation? We're talking about persistent inflation. We're talking about higher wage pressures, higher borrowing costs, right? And then maybe what we're used to pre-COVID, things like that. What that's going to impact on those capital budgets or even, again, your rate studies, so on and so forth, going to have some pretty broad impact on them. If the cost of doing nothing is so important, though, right? If we just say, well, let's wait to act on these things. Well, you're only kicking that can down the road. We're talking about the next couple of years of higher levels of inflation. Now that project that you're scoping out is even more costly, and the borrowing world might be, still elevated. So that's not really helpful. And again, context is key here. Is there some downside pressure in the borrowing world as we head into 2026? The market is suggesting that. But again, it's not, the pre-COVID period. Now, we're using all of this for that proactive planning. We're trying to say stress test these figures in those budgets. Now, we've talked a lot about cost. We've talked a lot about inflation, and that's very important. But remember, Patrick said you can't have inflation without, or higher levels of inflation without having that demand side, or generally speaking, right? We think about that supply and demand. We think about what that has to do with, pricing. Well, economic demand can be measured broadly speaking, right? If you, again, log into the old Wall Street Journal there, real gross domestic product. That is the really broad level or measure of overall economic output in many countries and in the US. Now, here we're looking at on a year-over-year basis, and I know just recently we got Q2's result, and it was positive. Q1 was actually negative quarter to quarter. But if we look at it on a year-over-year basis, we're still in that 2%, which is about where it kind of historically exists. But I look at this measure and I say, boy, it doesn't quite have those clean, cyclical, peaks and troughs that we're used to in maybe the inflation environment, or maybe, some of your sales data, your revenue data, what have you. And so one, it might be is because it's really broad and we're looking at all of the states in the US. And as we know, if we look at state level GDP, there's definitely a difference. But right, it's got a lot to do with where you are, what measure is important for you, and Patrick's going to level set there. So it's an important measure, but again, maybe take it in with a grain of salt in terms of that broad U.S. economic measure. When we start diving into, what's important in the U.S. economy, what comes to mind is the consumer. And so, right, if we think about what breaks down overall GDP, it broadly speaking is in these buckets. But I have highlighted the top two. Real personal consumption expenditures on goods and services. And I'm showing you 2025's year over year versus 2024. Now, right, we look at goods. 2025 is surpassing 2024. That's phenomenal, right? That means the US consumer is spending. And by the way, why that's so important is because over 2/3 of economic growth in the US is consumption, is US consumption. So spending on goods is good, right? It's a kind of a ticking boxes here on saying, well, okay, economic output is okay right now. If we go to services, we say, oh, well, it's definitely, underperforming compared to 2024, but it is still positive. It's still positive around 2%. These are good things, right? We're nearing the bottom of the business cycle or already have. And so we should expect some weakness. It's looking into the future, we should start seeing some growth, specifically as we head into 2026. There's a lot of other buckets, a lot of volatility around imports and exports, and we're not going to dive too far into that today. But I do want to talk a little bit about that consumer, because often I'm hearing, well, the consumer's in really bad shape. And then you look at some of the headlines and you say, well, geez, the labor market's actually somewhat tight. And that's why the Federal Reserve is trying to say, hey, we're going to keep rates elevated because the US consumer is still spending quite strong. Well, one of the things that we read about is credit card delinquencies. Now, we're going to pause on credit card debt because generally speaking, it always grows overall, right? Because as the US consumer grows and the US economy grows, we take on more debt. But if we look at delinquency rates, are we paying that debt off? Delinquency rates are rising, but they're starting to have that cyclical decline. They're starting to slow the pace of growth on delinquencies. That's good, right? We're starting to kind of level set in where we are with higher levels of interest rates. If we look at residential mortgage delinquencies, I mean, they're pretty much, at not all-time lows, but if you look historically speaking, they're very, very low. The U.S. consumer kind of got a very big slap in the face, if you will, during that Great Recession timeframe, and there's not a lot of chances being taken on that. And then ultimately, we look at that labor force summary. Overall, not too shabby. We actually have more job openings than unemployed right now, which again, that doesn't mean that there aren't markets that are feeling pain, but generally speaking, the U.S. consumer is okay. That actually, again, suggests and gives us that evidence to support why wage growth is likely to be higher over the next couple years.
So why is Jeremy spending all of this time talking about the U.S. consumer? I know we're talking about how important that is for the macroeconomy, but we just want to emphasize the macroeconomy is important on your budgeting process. Obviously, the inflationary environment on the cost side, but the demands on the revenue side. The consumer has implications for water demands. And we wanted to use a real world example to make this point. And we focus on the consumer. One of the great ways to measure consumer activity with hard data is retail sales. And that's that orange line there. What is going on with retail sales, the spending from the consumer? And if the consumer's spending money, it's generally a proxy that they're feeling okay to continue spending money. And what we've done then is overlaid that retail sales against communities, an organization that's more residentially based, more of a bedroom community. We're looking at their water usage per equivalent residential connection, and that's that black dotted line there. And gosh, they trend pretty nicely with one another. And I know there's a lot of things that get factored into water demands. You can talk about weather and climate and how that relates to things like irrigation. You can talk about new account growth, which we'll get to. So that's why we're just looking at usage per equivalent residential connection. And you can talk about just efficiency standards and new meters that are more efficient. But when we just zoom out and say, well, is there a relationship between the overall macroeconomic environment and the willingness to spend on water, I see it, right? When we just look at an all else equal water usage per ERC, we see a trend for this community with retail sales. In fact, retail sales leads by about 8 months. So ebbs and flows that happen in retail sales today tend to suggest what's going to happen with consumer behaviors as it relates to their water usage. If you're an irrigator, you might be less willing to irrigate if you're feeling your budget getting constrained and tightened. If you're thinking about areas to cut on budgets, you might be a little bit more strict on showering times or watering times, or filling of pools or what have you. And we see it in the data. As the macroeconomy ebbs and flows in this community from the consumer standpoint, we see that changing. But it does depend on what community we're talking about. bedroom communities might have a stronger relationship to how the consumer is feeling, what's going on with retail sales. If you have a stronger industrial base or more production based within your organization or within your service area, you have some big industrial users, that might also play a role. And so again, just wanted to reemphasize our forecast on industrial production. What is the US economy actually producing? And this might be a good measure to consider as it relates to your own patterns within your own budgets and what you should be planning for. We aren't talking about a huge liftoff in growth, but we're not talking about a contraction either. As a reminder, we showed this forecast earlier. We like to think about it as a good measurement of US economic activity and what we're producing, and we're forecasting modest levels of growth. 2025 about 1.5%, 2026 about 1.8%. Now, all forecasts are put in to basically die, but at the end of the day, we are intensely looking at that 2026 forecast. And again, I think there's folks on the phone, not all just US based, but also wanted to overlay what we're seeing in the Canadian market. And generally, historically, the Canadian manufacturing in the black dashed line has trended pretty in sync with the US industrial production line, that orange line. But as more reshoring and reorganization of trade patterns has gone underway the past few months here, you can see a bit of a divergence between the orange and black dotted lines right around that 2025 period. We're seeing a bit more weakness within the Canadian production space. And so just want to, again, be very mindful that even though we're talking macroeconomics is not just one indicator. It's a variety of economic indicators. And it's important for us as planners, as budgeters, as finance folks to think about what drives our growth or what drives headwinds into our space. Another really important consideration is the construction environment. And wanted to kind of just round out our conversation because this one hits a bit more home when we think about what's going on with meter growth. And if we think about just national construction levels, we have both residential and non-residential combined within this one chart. And what we're doing is in the orange, that is the annual year-over-year percentage change. That is considering the annual moving average as it relates to the prior year's annual moving average. And then in the dashed black line, we're talking about the quarterly year-over-year change, that quarterly moving average as it relates to the prior quarters. And we get leading signals for what that quarterly year-over-year is suggesting, and it's suggesting more weakness. In fact, Jeremy and I are talking about more recessionary pressures within the residential and non-residential space. Residential facing those housing affordability challenges that Jeremy mentioned. We see some improving trends signaling optimism for the later portion of 2026, but more weakness is signaled there. But we don't live down into the recession territory, and we tend to see the ebbs and flows of cyclicality reemerge, and we are anticipating that more in the back half of 2026. On the non-residential side, we're seeing that the borrowing costs are weighing on construction there. We're seeing higher levels of vacancy rates in, say, areas specifically like offices, and that tends to trail the residential market, the residential housing starts or single unit housing starts by about 2 years. And so we consider what's going on in the non-residential space, also weakness in that construction. And again, why does this matter? Well, we wanted to bring another example of how you need to be thinking about your planning efforts and what it means for new meter growth. And so we have another situation where we considered new meter growth as it relates to construction. But what we've done is looked at a community's meter growth in orange and then compared that to the metropolitan statistical areas construction. And that's that black dash line. And we overlay those two amongst each other, and we can get good signals, and you can see how they fit amongst one another, and using that to forecast out that meter growth into the future. As I mentioned, we don't live in negative territory. And so this community was very concerned about how they should be planning for new meter growth. Well, we need to leverage those local economic trends. What's going on in that MSA construction? What's going on in things like permitting activities? What's going on in things like just migration patterns, population growth, and what have you? And so when we sync all these together, you can talk about the change in the usage profile and the change in meter accounts and have a better sense of what revenue you should be anticipating for 2025, 2026, and into the future. Better precision planning. And so when we kind of put this all together, I want to think about just the nuggets to take home. We're spraying the old economic fire hose, and we want to save plenty of time for questions that folks may have. But if we consider what we are talking about in the short term, because I want that precision planning to consider short term, medium term, and long term. In the short term, we are talking about modest levels of economic growth, not a liftoff by any means, but modest levels of economic growth. We want to keep a watchful eye on that economic growth in 2026, specifically as it relates to a lot of the leading indicators. Like, again, could spend an hour talking about all these leading indicators, but things that were top of mind is what's going on with the bond market, what's going on with money supply, what's going on with liquidity, what's going on with that consumer health profile, business health profile. And again, that we are getting some mixed signals for the later part of 2026. So we're going to continue to track that. As it relates to the construction space, we are seeing some of that bifurcation in construction trends, whether we're talking locally in local markets facing those construction trends or by segment of construction, whether you're talking about industrial construction of new manufacturing facilities, relative to, say, office construction or retail construction. And so, again, knowing how you relate to these trends and what are the core drivers in your demands within your organization is so fundamental to this precision planning. And I think we may have beaten the dead horse on that last bullet, but resumed rise in inflation. Plan for higher levels of inflation with your operating expenditures, with your future look on your capital expenditures, and what that means for your overall budget planning.
I think when we start thinking about that linear planning, if you were to say, okay, let's take that advice and use it over the next few years, I have to remind you all that, again, we go through those ebbs and flows. We go through business cycles. And so over the next couple of years, we would actually expect the economy to peak and start to wane a bit. Again, momentum shifting. We're going to enter that deceleration growth. Again, if you think about just the broad economic outlook. Now, borrowing costs are unlikely to return to that low levels of 2010. So even as the economy, maybe slows down just a bit, or at least growth begins to slow, we would be unlikely to have the borrowing world, go back to too low. As of right now, we're not really forecasting a full-blown recession as we head into, the next few years. I mean, when I think about that, I think about, 3+. But there's definitely some evidence to support it. It may happen, which could put some downside pressure on the borrowing cost, part of the world. But again, as of right now, mild, or maybe kind of skimming that zero line, if you will. So mild levels of recession.
And then longer term, something that's top of our minds as it relates to the most advanced nation economies, but we have a huge departure of an older demographic that is entering a well-deserved retirement, exiting the labor market. And there's two core considerations there. What does that mean for your own employment practices? How are you prepared to receive a newer generation? How are you prepared to potentially leverage technology and innovation to offset that skills gap? Because as we mentioned, the headcount isn't quite there and the skill isn't quite there to really kind of backfill a pretty powerful, pretty strong demographic that's exiting the marketplace, but also consider your local service areas. If you have a huge population of retirees, what does that mean to your demand planning? If you have a huge inflow of folks, say you're a community that has a lot of golf courses, we tend to see a lot more in-migration as these folks end up retiring, and making sure you're staying in front of that new flow and new trend. I know that's Jeremy and my goal, is to find those golf communities and move in and, reduce our handicaps from a 40 to maybe a 38. Dare to dream. And then as we think about just the long-term cyclical analysis, we think about that 3, 4, 5-year period of time. The potential of recession emerges within our long-term outlooks. And again, just making sure that you are precisely planning, making sure that you are buying low, selling high. The bottom of a cycle is a great time to lock in on contracts. The bottom of the cycle is a great time to get your staffing needs in place and your training
right
programs
now, right?
in place. Exactly.
Yeah, something
so
we're dealing
how
with.
do you
with
prepare?
right now. Yep,
Use
absolutely.
the cycles to your advantage.
All right. I
So I
think one of
know
our
we've
favorite parts of the presentation, right, where we can open it up to questions. If I recall, there's a little chat feature that you all can write them out.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Fellowship, for sharing. I know I'm definitely interested in that golf community plan and lowering my handicap, so I'm ready to join you. You're right. We have received some questions already, but I encourage our listeners to continue submitting them via the Q&A drop-down located at the top panel of your screen, just near that chat function. So I think our first question here is for Jeremy. Can you forecast more custom cost metrics that reflect our specific market and cost structures?
Yeah, it's a great question because we get this and we say, and I'm assuming the person who asked it is probably going, well, this is a lot of national, levels, right? And we go, yes, absolutely, right? You start going into price per kilowatt hours, for example, in your state area, right? That's going to probably differ than some of the national figures. So absolutely, the some of that data can get quite granular. And then what we can do is to say, well, let's look at your cost profile because maybe, someone else's is 20% electricity and someone else's is, the remaining labor, but that might be different for you. And so what we'll want to do is actually look to see, well, what are you dealing with from a cost perspective? And then we can combine those cost escalations to give you that forward look. So you're absolutely right. We can get a little bit more granular than that national view.
And to find their contact information, again, it is sitting there in your Q&A panel. So when you have those closer to home questions, you can reach out. Pat, this next one's for you. We are a water and wastewater utility and noticed a drop off in new meter growth. Is this a trend we should expect for the next few years, or is this temporary? I think they're kind of leaning towards that one of those last couple of slides you guys had.
Yeah, and ultimately speaking, local construction trends are a huge driver of this. If I think about the zoomed out portion or the zoomed out look, we don't live in negative territory as an economy. When I talk about those construction trends, Jeremy and I are forecasting more weakness throughout the remainder of this year into next year. And then the latter part of 2026, we expect to see growth within housing construction and even non-residential construction. Now, communities, you have a variety of impacts. Most real estate is localized, or a lot of those trends are localized, which is why we like to look at those MSA, the statistical areas, construction activity to get a better sense. Is this a persistent trend of negativity that is just showcasing an erosion of activity? And so I hate to be the kind of two-handed economist, but it does depend on your local measures, your local trends and statistics. But if you're looking at the aggregate U.S. economy and you trend with the aggregate U.S. economy, I would not expect to live in there for the foreseeable future. It's more of a 1 to 1.5 year trend.
All right, next one for you, Jeremy. If the Fed doesn't drop interest rates this year, will this impact your forecast for inflation?
Yeah, so if we think about some of the, I guess, upside pressures and downside pressures or risks to some of our forecasts, I'll tell you, for the last couple months, we've been actually saying, when we think about our maybe, let's talk inflation forecast, it could put downside pressure on that. Again, as the Fed maybe intentionally keeps rates high to slow that demand down. And so it is something we're keeping an eye on. Again, if you were to maybe go back a year ago, we would have expected that summer timeframe or again that June-July meeting to say rates should have been declining again, and instead they've kind of plateaued or they've held them steady. So yes, it is a risk. If we fast forward though and we say, okay, well, what is the market expecting now? As a matter of fact, last week after I think the PCE data came out, the market said, well, geez, we should be expecting the Federal Reserve to drop interest rates by about 0.25. So not a big amount, but we would expect to see that in September. And I'm still a little bit cautious on that. The market can play out probabilities, and they've actually been somewhat incorrect over the last 6 to 8 months or so. And again, that makes sense because the Fed is been kind of wishy-washy on their tone. But nonetheless, it would be likely to see at least 0.25, a 0.25% drop, or basis point drop, as they say, in the federal funds rate, which is good. That would actually kind of put some upside pressure on demand, and then again upside pressure on inflation. So right now it's risk, but we haven't revised our forecast on the inflation side for that because we still are expecting slight decreases. And then if we look at the wage profile, it's still quite elevated, and that's going to put that upside pressure on pricing. So we're keeping an eye on it, but so far haven't revised. So tune in if you see some of those revisions, which again, as of now, we have not.
All right, as we are heading towards the top of the hour, I'm going to give it one last call here for questions. And while I allow those to flow in, I do want to remind our audience that our next presentation will be in 2 weeks on Wednesday, the 27th, where Fred Johnson will be talking about how to bolster cybersecurity, better protect critical infrastructure, and stay ahead of the rapidly evolving threat landscape. The registration link for that webinar is also in your Q&A panel. We hope to see you again there soon. All right, and with that, I don't see a lot more coming in here, so I want to wrap it up for today. Thanks, fellas, and thank you for all of your participation. If you have any other questions for our experts, their contact info is in the chat window. You will receive an email in the coming weeks with your participation certificate. We'll also be posting this presentation on stantec.com if you'd like to listen again or share with a colleague. And with that, I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and we'll see you again in another water webinar from Stantec.